Question: what are you a fan of? Is it a movie, a book, a TV show, a music group, a sports team, or maybe something less conventional? I'm Regan.
And I'm Christian. We've spent over 10 years working in the customer service and entertainment industries. It's this experience which leads us to believe that everyone has a compelling, personal connection to the things that they are a fan of.
And we're here to uncover the secret fandoms of the Gulf Coast's VIPs. Join us as we talk with passionate fans about what they love. On this episode of Fantastic People,
going through a few rough relationships, and then just last year in general, pandemic's been very mentally and emotionally taxing, and it brings out a lot of emotions and a lot of issues in everyone's day-to-day operations, because we've lost a lot of communication in certain instances. So it became like a comfort. It really is sort of a comfort. There's a lot going on, and people aren't able to go to the office, and you're not able to go do the things that you really want to do. So it became well, if I'm here, I might as well watch some movies that I'm really going to enjoy, because this is going to be a safe space for me.
We are joined by Jared Miller. Jared lived in Pensacola for 13 years, where he attended middle school and high school. Currently, he is a library assistant at a local downtown library in Casa, Grande, Arizona. When Jared is not arranging the shelves of the library, he is time-traveling 20,000 leagues under the sea and warring with the worlds on the day the Earth stood still via 1950s and 60s science fiction films. This episode of Fantastic People is sponsored by Hellcat Hangar in Pensacola, Florida. Hellcat Hangar's venture is to build a thriving network of individuals and opportunities centered around the production arts and media. They strive to provide exceptional service as a production studio, valuable insight and education, and to enrich the overall industry across the Gulf Coast. They open their doors as a business, a venue, and as a community event center, but in all manners, their doors are open to cultivate a culture of togetherness. To join the Hellcat Hangar community or reserve a time for your event, you can find them online at hellcathangar.com or call 850-341-7403.
You don't live here anymore. Where are you at now? What took you away from the old Gulf Coast?
Well, I had a failed relationship and ended up moving back to San Diego late 2013.
Because that's where you're originally from, right?
Yeah. So I moved back close to where I grew up, essentially, but a marriage that didn't work well, and stayed there for, how long was it? Close to 8 years. So it was late 2013. I'm actually getting married next Monday, so I should just call. So I have a Kate too, and you have a Kate, so we both have Kates. So yep. I could just say JK, and then it'll probably be easier. So Kate and I moved Halloween last year from East County, San Diego to Casa Grande, Arizona, because the cost of living, my insurance rates, pretty much everything was a lot cheaper. So it's a smaller town. It's kind of like a farm community, but we're about an hour south of Phoenix, so we're not too far away from the busy metro. But the locals around here say Casa Grande. So, if you hear it differently from anybody, I try to pronounce it the way it should be pronounced, but it's definitely been a culture change. But and definitely living in the deep desert. I miss springtime, but we don't have that out here.
Oh, yeah, sure. You talk about people pronouncing it that way. That always reminds me of a Pensacola thing. Mm-hmm. People saying, Cervantes.
Oh, my gosh.
That's how people here say it. And someone's like, well, should be Cervantes. And you're like, well, I get it. But
GPS says Cervantes.
Yeah. Well, my GPS is an Irish woman, so that's not how she says it.
Oh, in San Diego, it's terrible because everything's a name the GPS can't pronounce. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you do for a living, man, now that you're in Arizona?
It took a little bit of time, but I'm working as a library assistant now for the public library, so I've come completely full circle from my first job working for the West Florida Public Library. So I'm back at it again, doing very much the same thing that I was doing before, back when I was 19. So And I love it.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, listen, I obviously I'm not a librarian, and in some regard, I've probably romanticized this a bit. But being a librarian or working in a bookstore, like dream job for me. Sound like the best thing a person could possibly.
Oh, and I've done both of those too, actually. So yeah, did the bookstore.
I'm highly jealous of you, man. That sounds like the perfect way to spend a day.
It's distracting. Let's just say that, because you want to just sit there and go, oh, that's cool. I want to read that. Oh, that's really cool. I want to watch that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would absolutely have that problem. Yeah. There's a guy here in town who, I won't say his name or his business's name, but he owns a bookstore. And I think he's retired, and he literally just runs the bookstore for something to do. Like, the books aren't even like on shelves; they're just in stacks. And he's like, "Oh yeah, I got that. I think it's in that pile over there. You know, just go dig through that." And I want to be that guy so bad when I'm 70 years old.
Yeah,
that's a dream.
I could not do that job. I'd be really good at it, but I can't do it. I'm too much of a perfectionist. Like, I would do nothing. I mean, nothing but walk around, making sure that things are symmetrical, in their place, and not out of order. Like,
so you should be a librarian.
That's what I'm saying. I'd be really good at it, but it would be to
a detriment.
Yes, detriment. I would never leave because there would always be something out of place that I must locate.
Oh, for sure.
Put it back, and then I'd start yelling at people and getting frustrated with them for being terrible employees and not caring as much as they should.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, cataloging has definitely a lot to do with the job. And Regan, you'd probably spend all your time in the children's section because all children are little cyclones to destroy the books.
Oh, yeah.
So.
I didn't even think about that. So I'm really excited to talk to you because we have never talked about this topic. And we don't have many topics that are like carryover, but this one is so specific. Jared, what are you a fan of?
So I'm a massive fan of 1950s and early 1960s science fiction movies.
Can you now, for the untrained ear of what the difference is, what separates that period of science fiction versus other films?
So 1950s, starting in 1950, science fiction really took off. Before that period, you have maybe like just little droplets of films. There were like German expressionist films like Metropolis in the late 1920s. And actually, H.G. Wells got involved with a production in 1936 for his own work, The Shape of Things to Come, which became Things to Come. And they're just very few and far between. You have a lot of magazines, a lot of books leading up to that period, but there's no American science fiction films until the 50s. And it's the grandfather, it's the golden age that really influenced everything to come afterwards. And it's just fascinating to me.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm probably going to sound like an idiot for asking it, but I'm curious because of your expertise and fandom of this subject. Do you think that the presence of the subject of UFOs coming out in the late 1940s, early 1950s influenced the popularity of this genre in the late 1950s?
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated, is because the social, cultural, political motives that were kind of going on from after World War II leading up to 1950, it's just a gigantic, it was a time bomb essentially, perfect for this time period, because you have, on the one hand, this economic prosperity where people are moving to the suburbs and people they have disposable income now. And there's also that deep-seated fear that there could be a communist takeover, and there could be
McCarthyism.
And it could be UFOs coming down to take over, because Air Force personnel are seeing UFOs in northern Washington and seeing the Roswell event and everything like that. And I think it's really fascinating. I actually have a book that details specific events that happened through the late 40s that led up to those events that influenced the films just 3 years after a lot of these events happened.
That's interesting. I don't feel so stupid for asking it now. I see, because my familiarity with this subject is not much. I probably come in a little later. I'm a big Star Trek guy. We recently have a Star Trek episode come out. And I have seen things like The Day the Earth Stood Still and War of the Worlds, and have some, especially like with War of the Worlds, some of the history of that specific topic. But I'm much more into the UFO side of it. Like, that's just that is something that really interests me. But I had never really made the connection of this phenomenon starting to, because of advances in technology and the way news spread and popularity and TV, the influence that it started to have affected entertainment, I'm sure, which is why we maybe saw this explosion.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely what happened. And there, as a side note, there's also another interesting event that happened in the late 40s, and there was a lawsuit that Paramount and MGM and a lot of major studios were slapped with that allowed them for decades to monopolize movie theaters because they were getting benefits from the movie theaters. They owned the theaters. And the Supreme Court decided to break that monopoly up. So a lot of independent studios started sprouting up in the late 40s. And that's when you get this heavy proliferation of those kinds of films. And some films that you wouldn't necessarily, some things like we're talking like $50,000, $70,000 budgets, and they become kind of like cult icons because of this massive boom in like smaller studios.
I have a second question I want to ask you, but I want to follow up this while you're talking about it. Do you think that is this the birth of cult films? Is early science fiction?
I think so. I would say there's a few that had rested in the decade prior. I'm also a pretty big fan of like crime noir, film noir. It's probably my favorite read. And you have a lot of B pictures throughout like the 40s that kind of mirror that genre, where it's very low budget. You're lucky to get an actor that might be like a B movie actor. They have a very basic plots, but the explosion and the kind of cultural zeitgeist, really B movies took off in the 50s to where you're like 6 years old, you go to the theaters and spend 10 cents on the ticket and you spend 15 cents on popcorn and you see a pretty decent picture. And then you see something where the monster's in like a plastic suit that's like dragging around like there's actually like a movie from the early 60s to where the budget was so low, the director stapled a bunch of shag carpets together, and that's the monster, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but I love that.
It's great.
It so much.
It can't happen today. It's something that never can happen today unless we're talking like college level, like small films for like film students, film classes. But there's just too much of a high expectation from film studios to where it's just not the same. There's some kind of like magic that happened in the 50s and 60s to where any old schmuck in Hollywood could go, yeah, you know what? I'm going to throw $30,000 at the wall and we'll create this goofy monster pick that's going to be like a cult classic.
Yeah, I was in preparation for this episode. I realized I probably have very little knowledge of 50s and 60s sci-fi movies. So I Googled it. I was like, all right, what movies are there? And there was a long list.
Oh, yeah.
Most of which I have never heard of. But it was intriguing. I was like, and I'm looking at the poster images or the cover images, and I'm reading the titles. And I'm like, this looks like a lot, number one. But as goofy as they looked, as low budget as they looked, as just messy, all around messy, I want to know more. Like, I want to watch these movies because of just they seem to be wild and all over the place.
You're at the right time though, because you have been watching Doctor Who.
Sure.
And
you're right.
There's a lot of Doctor Who that I think doesn't translate to American audiences today
Right.
because of how dated, quote unquote, cheap that it looks. But I personally think the more you watch it, the more you appreciate it
for sure
in that show.
Oh, it's an art form.
And so looking at something from like the 50s or 60s where it looks like somebody in their backyard put it together, you kind of already have accepted that by watching Doctor Who.
Well,
and it's probably easier to get on board with that.
And it requires a little bit of suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
A lot of it.
Well,
actually.
it makes you do some of the work. And
right.
I think
It's imagination. And you have to recognize that these people are putting these things together with what they have and what they can make work. And technology was non-existent. They were pioneering a lot of things.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
So you have to just appreciate that, understand what they're attempting to communicate to you, regardless of what it actually looks like and how cheap it looks.
Yeah.
And understand that it's supposed to be this thing, so I'm going to believe it's this thing. Much like stage play and things like that you're sitting in a theater, you're sitting in a room, and you're watching these live props and things happen, and there's a lot of variables. And so it requires some of that. I think we've become spoiled in our modern technology for movies.
Absolutely.
They do everything they possibly can to make it so we don't have to do any of the imaginative work, which I think does a disservice to movies of that era and those decades.
I think it does a disservice to movies in general, because I think one thing that we think is good, a term we throw out that may be controversial, but the suspension of disbelief is not a good thing for the audience member.
Mm-hmm.
It can be cool. When I watch Lord of the Rings, I believe that is real, that is as close to Middle Earth as Tolkien intended, and Peter Jackson hit it. However, I don't need that for John Wick. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need it to be hyper violent and hyper real or whatever. I'm not dissing. I like those movies, but the suspension of disbelief is not always a good thing. And I think appreciating, Jared, this is what I think is so special about this topic, is being able to appreciate it for what it is. Here we are 60, 70 years later. Is a gift to you, because it allows you to appreciate an art form that kind of doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it kind of allows me to live the life, like the just vicarious life of like a 6-year-old from like 65 years ago.
Oh yeah.
So even though I didn't experience it personally, it's something that it's very comforting, and it's like a warm blanket almost, to where it became something that was just so incredibly fascinating, and the history of it is so rich. But yeah, I mean, suspension of disbelief is definitely something I would say that if I watch something that doesn't really have the acting and like great dialogue and music, but it has like this ridiculous budget nowadays for new movies, because so many movies come out that it's absolutely insane to keep up with everything nowadays.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have that same feeling. But I can watch something that's like got a $50,000 to $100,000 budget. I can watch like the original Blob movie and know that it's just like this amalgamation of like red gel packets together, and it looks so ridiculous, but it's just a piece of history, and it's culturally just so incredibly interesting to see. So.
Yeah, speaking of being 6 or 7, when did you first experience?
I would say probably like Christian. I mean, when I was a kid, I saw Day the Earth Stood Still, and I saw War of the Worlds. It's kind of like, those are staples. I mean, a lot of people, it was just a very common thing. We had a close family friend that would usually put on some very strange movies. I watched probably a lot of horror movies from the 80s that I probably shouldn't have watched when I was 8 years old. But I thought that was really fascinating. I thought practical effects were just incredibly fascinating, the work that went into them, even when I was a kid. But this interest didn't really hit me until probably about 2012, and I started rewatching. I got some recommendations from my dad. He grew up in the era. He was born in the mid-50s, so I mean, he saw a lot of B pictures in like the early 60s, mid-60s. They re-showed a lot of these movies when he was a kid. So he would give me recommendations, and I just remember sitting in my capstone English class at UWF, and Professor David Earl was like, "Here you guys go. This is your topic. You guys all have to cover classic pulp magazines from like the 20s through the 40s. And I remember just Googling all of these sci-fi titles and just being amazed by how incredibly detailed the covers were. And the first one I had was from 1933. And there's like this weird ladybug like alien beetle that's capturing a woman, and there's a guy in a spacesuit that's running after her and trying to rescue her. And I just thought it was just completely fascinating. And so I started delving into this history, and then I started reading about people like Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov. And when Isaac Asimov was a kid, he turned to his dad and saw a copy of like Thrilling Wonder Stories or Science Wonder Stories or something like that. And his dad turned and said, "Well, it has science in the title, so that means it has to be educational." And he became a fan of that. And that's what spurned his interest. And then that just fascinated me with like just learning about the history of sci-fi. And then once I delved into the films, they became a final projection of what had started in those magazines in the 20s and 30s. And I thought it was just incredible. And it just kept going from there. So
this is kind of off topic, but more so related, but a recommendation. Have you seen the show Mythic Quest, Jared?
Sounds familiar. I've seen like 1 or 2 episodes.
Yeah, Mythic Quest is a show on Apple TV. It's about a video game company. Mm-hmm. But one of the things is there's a fantasy writer
who writes for the video game that they show. And there's a special kind of like flashback episode. It's like a one-off. And it's him as like a straight out of college student. And he gets to work for the publishing company of Isaac Asimov. And so he has some, interactions with him. And a lot of it is like kind of philosophical on what you think, fantasy and science fiction. And I think those two genres are very closely related. Mm-hmm. The influence they have on society and the kind of futurism that falls within them. And what's interesting to me is when I watched that episode, I generally liked it. And I liked how it described kind of that influence that science fiction has on a person. But what's really interesting to hear you talk about it is because it sounds like a very similar experience when I think there are these people that just kind of transcend time and transcend media. And we kind of dilute them a little bit in our modern society because of how interconnected we all are all the time. But there was this thing, especially I think Isaac Asimov, that like you give somebody like, I don't know, iRobot or something, right? And there's an immediate connection. There's an immediate like, oh, I want to know more after I discover who this person is or I discover their works. Ray Bradbury, very similar. And I, again, don't want to diss on the public education system because we're all products of it. But I think this is one thing when we're told to read something, it's hard for us to appreciate it because we're mandated to read it. But I remember reading Ray Bradbury in high school and just being blown away by the contents of some of these stories. And I also a fan of film, but I never thought about translating it over to that space. But you really make me want to. You really want to make me want to kind of go back to this birth of science fiction in the 1950s and really kind of study how it is in that cinematic space as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's really nothing else like it because there wasn't really much as far as it translated onto film up until the 1950s. You had maybe a handful of serials. That was when Flash Gordon became really popular in like the mid to late 30s. You have a lot of those, but they're really a product of like the late 30s and 40s. Everything's very Art Deco. Everything's very, very cheap, but it was all just very typical romances in space, essentially. Punch the bad guy, you punch Ming the Merciless, and you save the girl. And that's the story of most of those. But those even translated into the 50s. But yeah, works of Ray Bradbury, the works of a lot of very significant authors became just incredible works of art in the 50s. There's a guy that I follow on YouTube. His name is Serial at Midnight. And he's a very big proponent of physical media. And that became a big thing for me a couple of years ago. And he talks about movies like they're pieces of art. And it's kind of our job to preserve that kind of art. And if we have it, we have something physical to touch and we can play it in the system and see all of the work that goes into it. I was such a proponent for streaming for so long, but about a year and a half ago, Criterion released their own copy of War of the Worlds, and it's a 4K restoration. So when I went back and I replayed the digital copy, it didn't hold a candle to it. And I was like, I wonder why, because you'd think that they put all this effort into the digital, but then I watched behind the scenes and they have Paramount executives going through all the details of getting sound and visual experts to clean up the original negatives and put in their own sounds that mirror the sound effects of the Martian hovercraft blasters and just the work that goes into it. And I think by preserving those kinds of little documentaries as well, and these science fiction historians, it's really just incredible for generations to come. I mean, it's something that I would love for people to kind of discover, because it's something that I think in our modern age, it just kind of gets brushed under the rug.
What's funny is you saying all that reminds me of a Ray Bradbury story of Fahrenheit 451, the need for physical media and how to carry it on, and how the destruction of that can be very bad for society.
Yeah. We almost watched that today.
Well, wait, don't watch the 70s movie one. It's weird.
Oh, really? That's what I tried to find. I couldn't find it, so we just landed on. There's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
There's a new version of Fahrenheit. This is off topic, but there's a brand new version of Fahrenheit 451 with
Michael Shannon in it. Yeah.
Yep, Michael. Yep, and I have not watched that one. Has there ever been a time where maybe this kind of love, one thing we've discovered with fandom is a lot of times it's like a home that people can come back to, where this thing is going on, you're like, you know what, I'm just going to turn on some old sci-fi movies and kind of find some peace.
I would say probably, going through a few rough relationships, and then just last year in general. I mean, pandemic's been very mentally and emotionally taxing, and brings out a lot of emotions and a lot of issues in everyone's day-to-day operations, because we've lost a lot of communication in certain instances. So it became a comfort. It really is sort of a comfort. Like, there's a lot going on, and people aren't able to go to the office, and you're not able to go do the things that you really want to do. So it became, well, if I'm here, I might as well watch some movies that I'm really going to enjoy, because this is going to be a safe space for me.
I think you hit on something that we all can connect to, which is the pandemic has been just incredibly hard, and the importance, I think, of having a fandom, which just feels such an official word, but having the importance of loving something that doesn't really bear the stress of day-to-day life is such a good escape. It's such a great way to deal with all the stuff that's going on in the world. Take Tiger King, for example. There was a reason why Tiger King was as popular as it was. And I don't know, maybe COVID-19 is a product of Netflix, but like the fact that coincided perfectly with lockdown, that's why we all love Tiger King. It really wasn't because of Tiger King.
It gave us something to forget what was going on outside and to unite and connect.
I think this is a perfect description of why I think people who maybe expect a nerdy thing on this podcast, and don't get me wrong, the vast majority of what we talk about is nerdy. We've had people who do woodworking, people who just talk about sitting in coffee shops, listening to Kendrick Lamar. It's a wide variety of things because we all need that in some capacity. And it's so weird. It's so weird to me that this is a subject that I have not really gravitated to, because like I freaking love Tomorrowland. Like that retro version of what the future should have been like. I freaking love it.
Yeah.
I want to decorate my house.
Absolutely. You've touched on another aspect that I really appreciate, that just goes beyond anything. And I'm so fascinated with these artists that created these retro-futurism visions of the future. And even today, I'll have a conversation with my dad, and he'll be like, where's my hover car? Where's my jetpack? We should have all these things. And that's what Disney's original Tomorrowland had sort of promised. And I'm a big fan of, there was a 1950s through the early 60s broadcast that Disney did. It's called Disney's World Tomorrow, or Walt Disney's, I can't remember what it's called, but it's something similar to that. And he touched on Fantasyland, Frontierland. They were usually pretty broad interpretations. There would be like one that was King Henry's Court, and there'd be one that was based on cowboys in the Old West that was for Frontierland. But he did a few of them for a series of Tomorrowland, and one of them was about basic space travel, one was about travel to the moon, and the other one was about Mars. And the Martian one's so fascinating because at the end, the narrator's just going on talking about how at that time they had no idea what the surface of Mars would actually look like. Because the images that they had, they were still bringing back information, thinking that there were actual water canals on Mars and thinking that there was actually life on the surface of Mars. And so they have this retro-futurism kind of interpretation of what if creatures look like this? And it's completely insane to think that it's Disney because it's so out there, but it's so fascinating. And that's the way a lot of people thought then. They really thought that space travel, and we were going to have hydroponic glass structured houses, and everything was going to look like the Jetsons, but on Mars. And it's so cool, but it's kind of cool to immerse yourself in that and get lost in that, thinking, man, I really wish things were like that. But it's fun to watch because you can kind of live in that world for a short time.
But it's crazy. It's in some ways, some of that stuff did come to pass. Like when you think about that, it just didn't come to pass how we imagined it. But I love the look and design that those people had. I mean, nothing to me is cooler than a sleek, round UFO. That's just a cool design. And Spielberg famously made his a triangle and stuff like that. But there's something about that kind of retro idea of what the future was going to be like, or what even in tech science fiction and some of these that are kind of blend into sci-fi and science fiction horror, even of what the future threat would be. And it still is so almost whimsical in a way that I really just gravitate to it because it really feels like it kicks both the fantasy, the sci-fi, and even in some ways the horror love I have.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just this is an exciting topic because it makes me want to go back and dig deeper into it.
For sure. If you're a big fan of Star Trek, I think a good place to start, if you've never seen it, is Forbidden Planet. I think Forbidden Planet is on par with Day the Earth Stood Still. The stories still got a little bit of that 50s kind of sexist behavior to where the main crew is just a crew full of men and they haven't seen a woman for like 22 years. And even the history of the science was kind of ridiculous. And the opening, the narrator's talking about how in the 22nd century we finally landed on the moon. And I was, well, if you guys only knew that was going to happen in 13 years. So it's hilarious. And it's a loose retelling of The Tempest. But from that, we have humans in a UFO, and it looks just magnificent. The work that went into the matte paintings and just the design of the UFO, and it's the first movie to where humans are landing on an alien world in a UFO, and you have phasers, and you have at the beginning of the film teleporters, and Gene Roddenberry was a massive fan, and that's how that's how it influenced a lot of Star Trek. I mean, there's just a lot of aspects of 50s culture. I mean, there's a lot of movies. The original Thing from Another World, which became John Carpenter's The Thing, and the original Blob. I have this theory, and I've told Kate before that I thought that every time a movie came out in the 50s, another director in the 80s said, you know what? I'm going to make that grosser. I'm going to do that again. And
there's certainly a lot of that.
Yeah, that's just became a major thing, but it all started in the 50s. And all of those big films, The Thing from Another World, there's even one of Ray Bradbury's short stories, which it's kind of a loose adaptation too, is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And that was one of Ray Harryhausen's first stop motion works that he did independently. And when you read about all that and just the work that went into Harryhausen's stop motion, you move it a millimeter of an inch and then you take a shot, and then just the hours and days and months that went into that kind of work, you don't see that nowadays. I can look at something CGI. I mean, I admire the original, Lord of the Rings trilogy immensely, but when I watch the Hobbit trilogy, all I can see is CGI. But I can watch a Harryhausen production and go, that's a real model. And you can put yourself in the mind of an 8-year-old and think, that's a real Rhedosaur, and he's attacking New York because it's a real model that he painstakingly would move and destroy mock buildings and crushing clay model people and things like that. And it's just, it's so incredible to watch. But when you watch something that's clearly CGI, I mean, I know that we've come so far and it is incredible, but you kind of lose some of that fantasy and you lose that magic.
So you briefly said, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm following up. It sounds like maybe that appreciation for the art form, but what else keeps you coming back to it? I mean, you think that there's these movies haven't been made in 60 years while we've continued sci-fi, but it's changed greatly. Yeah. What keeps you coming back to this time period in these films?
I think that just the stories that they tell, a lot of them are just really interesting human dramas. And the ones that aren't, I mean, it's obviously for the UFOs and for the creatures, whether they're stop motion or whether it's a costume. It's so fun and cheeky, but it's just enjoyable. And I think that the amount of work that would go into these is incredible. And even the ones where the dialogue might be stilted and dry. One of my favorite films is actually one of the very first ones George Powell had worked on. It was his first film in the 1950s. It came out in 1950, and he had competed with another producer to get his film Destination Moon out before Robert Lippert got Rocket Ship XM out. And they're both stories of just, you have a tinny looking rocket ship that looks like a V-2 rocket, and their goal is just to try to get to the moon. And it's a similar kind of a theme for both of those movies. And it set that genre in motion in 1950. And that's kind of become my comfort movie. And the characters might be a little bit ridiculous. there's a guy in there who's like, they did this throughout the 50s, where there was a stereotypical kind of guy, and one of the guys is a stereotypical guy from Brooklyn, and he talks about New York and the Babes and, you know, the Dodgers and stuff like that throughout the whole movie. But it's just this perseverance, and it really was up to snuff with the science in 1950 as to what they thought it was going to be like when we landed on the moon. And it's just a really interesting adventure and a true telling of how our perseverance can allow us to achieve goals that we never thought were possible. And I think that that's just a great message, and it's really fascinating. And for a variety of reasons, there's a lot of joy I find in the 50s movies. Day of the Earth Stood still stands to this day by having a timeless message to where nuclear proliferation and the growth of our nuclear arsenal and the inner fighting that we do with other nations is something that is worrisome. And if there was a planet that was 10 light years away, they would probably feel threatened. And that is something that we really don't think about a lot in our society, but it still rings true today. And it's something that is so socially relevant that I'm just blown away that a 70-year-old movie can still hold true today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that's what's important about a lot of these movies is yes, it's fun. Yes, it's maybe campy. Yes, it's cheap, and it doesn't stand against the technical effects of today, but there's a message there. There's a lesson there. And that's what makes it timeless. That's what makes it important, is it's a commentary on not only society of that time, it's also a commentary on maybe where we should be or where we might end up if we don't make some changes, right? Yeah. And hopefully influence the culture, which on a less serious note on that, I think that what I find interesting about sci-fi movies in general, especially older and as you go, it's interesting to look back at the older ones and say, oh, wow, they thought this is what technology was going to be like. And to some degree, they influenced the movement forward of technology. But then it's also fun to look at current sci-fi movies and say, what are we imagining now? What are we thinking might be down the road? And sometimes it's a little silly. It's like, really? You think we're going to have that?
Or Black Mirror, which makes you be like, we should not do anything else with technology.
Yes, we need to stop because we've already progressed and it's already impacted us. Yeah, that's a great point. We always end on two questions, Jared. One of them is, what are some maybe criticisms that you have, constructive criticisms, for maybe the fan community of the 50s and 60s sci-fi movies?
I think the biggest issue is that the bulk members who follow this fandom are people who are really aging. It's kind of it really is something that I hadn't talked about a lot to a lot of people, because I feel like, oh, that's something a 70-year-old would like. And it makes me feel kind of slighted. And I think that the older generation kind of gets stuck in their ways. And I would like there to be more people who, you're not going to enjoy every single film. You're not going to enjoy the whole entire decade of films, but maybe check out something, maybe get a recommendation, and maybe the fandom can grow and you can have more people who are able to pass this on to even younger and younger generations. And it's something that I think in many ways is timeless. But I think that one of the biggest issues is just, there's just not enough people that are aware of a lot of these films. I think a lot of people's knowledge starts in like the 70s and 80s, and they don't go back that far, but I think they can find joy in pretty much finding any of these films. But there's a lot of other issues. There's also issues I find with just preserving these kinds of pieces, because a lot of these films are in just such bad shape. I have a few, just as an aside, there was this man that controlled Image Entertainment in the late 90s, and he bought out a bunch of Westerns and action and fantasy movies, and he bought a bunch of sci-fi movies. His name is Wade Williams, and he has for years refused to concede and demanded top dollar to get 4K scans and upgrade these to Blu-ray and get better copies of these movies so they can go through the original negatives and clean them up, because there was a handful of movies that are in such bad shape that you don't want to lose them to time. You don't want these to become forgotten relics that are never going to be dug up again. And one of those films was Flight to Mars. And I had the DVD, and there's popcorny, red spotty, like little pops. And there's 3 segments of the movie to where it cuts for about a few seconds. And he finally sold the rights to it to an independent boutique Blu-ray company. And that just released in July. And I just rewatched the new 4K scan, and it looks amazing. And I think that if a lot of people are more aware of that, we can keep preserving those films, and they'll become relics to enjoy rather than some buried treasure that no one's ever going to find.
Well, I think this kind of leads me to the second question we always ask is, what does the future hold?
Yeah.
Because what it sounds like is what it needs. And I hope maybe what your answer will be is just access to these things, both from a production standpoint, but also to a viewer standpoint.
Yeah.
Well, but what do you think? Where do you see these types of properties existing in 5 to 10 years?
I think it's still going to be a major thing, but there's always this debate over whether physical media is dying or whether digital media is taking over. And I think in a world when Disney's buying up everything and owning everything, that it's important to hold on to this. And these are things that you can still touch and treasure, and they're not going to go away. It's not going to be like a film that's on Netflix for 8 months and then they take it off, kind of a thing. But a lot of these movies I discovered, half of them I probably discovered through Netflix because they would occasionally pop up on there. And even though they're pretty crude, YouTube has a handful of copies for movies that don't have clear copyrights. And it's just a good introduction. And it's kind of dipping your feet in the, tide pool and just exploring. And if you find an interest in them, then it doesn't hurt to support these boutique labels that are trying to preserve these movies, because they're doing an amazing job. And I couldn't even imagine the work that goes into these cleanup 4K scan reissues, because I wish that for just about all of these films, and they're just such fun relics of the past, that's what I really hope for the future.
Tell us about both Discord channel and Letterboxd.
So it's not been a major accomplishment so far. I've been so hesitant because it's something that I felt has been very personal to me. But when I knew you guys were, when I finally stumbled upon your podcast and us knowing each other, this is a great outlet for this, and I'd like more people to know. And for years I kind of hid it because I thought it was kind of an embarrassment, because I thought people didn't really care. But I know you guys know Charles Mudge. He's the one that started our Discord channel. So we originally started a channel that was based on Magic the Gathering, because we're nerd fans of that, and we talk about that and D&D and a few other things. But we started having personal messages back and forth, and then he started a movie and book channel. And we don't have a lot of members, but it's something that I definitely am really passionate about. It's a Life According to Film on Discord. If anyone's ever interested, my personal handle is Burnt Toast. It's kind of a goofy name, but BURNTTOAST. And my number's 0393. But we just discuss general topics. He has everything broken down by genre. And honestly, we spend more time talking about sci-fi and horror than probably anything else. And it also leads to talking about books. I started ramping up my discussion of movies on Letterboxd as well. And it's a good way to kind of read people's interpretations of films. My handle on Letterboxd is Autecher88, and it's a IDM band. So it's AUTECHRE 88. My picture is my little terrier. So if you see a little tan terrier, you'll know you're in the right spot. And I've been wanting to put more reviews on there, but I haven't done a lot of getting the word out. And it's something that I've been tossing around, and I would just love to just sit down and have a conversation with people about this, because it's something that I think that anyone could be interested in. It's whatever age. It's something that's super fascinating to me. So if we can grow in our Discord channel, and I can get more people reading the Letterboxd reviews once I ramp those up, I'm hoping sometime in the future. I've been kind of on and off throwing out drafts of my own writing on the history of science fiction. And I think it's something that I want to continue in the future. And a lot of that has to do with gender representation in the 50s sci-fi, because a lot of them are very alpha male dominated, and I've never heard of a female scientist before, or a female doctor, and they're so outdated in their views and their approaches, and some of these are clear male driven fantasies, and it's something that I think obviously couldn't exist today, but you can watch it and go, well, that's so weird that is the way people thought 70 years ago. So something that I wanted to continue in the future, and hopefully that I can work on doing a minor publishing for that as well. But definitely check out the Discord. It's something we've been trying to get more members for, to have more discussions. And sometimes you can just take comfort in discussing movies, because in a world where we're kind of a little bit disconnected still because of the continuing pandemic, sometimes just logging on to Discord and going, hey, what do you guys think of this movie that's coming out? Or, hey, I watched this movie and it might be old to some people, but what do you guys think of the characters? And it's something really fascinating. And I think that we all can kind of connect to talking about films or books. And it's just something that's a really good comfort to everybody.
That's awesome, man. Well, we appreciate it. It's been great chatting with you.
Yeah.
Hey there. If you're still listening, that means you really enjoy this podcast and don't like missing even a second of it. For that reason, I'm going to tell you how to hear even more. By that, I mean the raw, fully unedited, behind the scenes kind of stuff. Go to fantasticpeoplepod.supercast.tech and become a premium member of Fantastic People. The link will be in the show notes. Like I said, by doing that, you'll get the raw, completely unedited cut of every episode, including much of our backlog. In addition, you'll get access to our Discord server, where we will host Ask Me Anythings and random fandom chats. But wait, there's more! You'll also get access to our upcoming recording schedule and the ability to submit questions for upcoming guests. Again, that's fantasticpeoplepod.supercast.tech.